14 September 1944, just after dawn, the low sun struggled through damp autumn mist outside Lunéville, where the 111th Panzer Brigade crept along narrow country lanes bordered by tangled hedgerows and sodden fields that smelled of churned soil and diesel. The clatter of Panzer IV tracks echoed against stone farm walls, a hollow reminder of shortages in fuel and spare road wheels. From the commander's cupola, the world looked grey and slow, dew clinging to spent brass wedged in turret seams. German infantry, forced to fan out along hedgerow breaks, advanced with nervous glances skyward. Allied fighter bombers had shredded convoys for weeks, and even the whisper of distant engines made junior officers flinch. When the first bursts came, they did not roar in a sweeping hose of fire. Instead, they pulsed, measured, separate, clean, touching road junction, turret rim and radio operator column in cold increments. Crews reported the sensation as a stepping sting, like invisible feet walking across steel. 2 Panzer Pfeifers stalled almost simultaneously, commanders slumping limp over open hatches, the smell of scorched wiring mixing with cordite. A surviving loader later recalled his helmet, ringing from ricochet sparks that seemed to skip deliberately along the hatch combing, leaving him certain, irrationally, that the gunner had aimed for his fear rather than his flesh. Confused radiomen filled the net with frantic fragments about wandering half-tracks or hidden armored cars, before crackling static swallowed them whole. German staff officers, hearing scattered after-action reports, demanded to know if the Americans had secretly increased the Browning M2's cyclic rate or modified its ammunition. Others, more superstitious, muttered that the enemy had found a way to make machine gun fire think. In truth, the devastation traced back to one unauthorized pattern, a mathematically spaced timing sweep drilled into muscle memory by a single American gunner. To understand how his innovation could ripple so far, the story must widen to the grinding ground combat realities that shaped soldiers' minds in the late summer of 1944, just before autumn's final push. February 1944 brought a brutal awakening to the Western Front as Allied formations pressed inland from Normandy's beachheads, pushing into a labyrinth of hedgerows and constricted village lanes that smelled of damp earth and cordite. Around St. Lo, the fighting compressed into close, grinding encounters where machine gun teams lugged their heavy tripods through choking bocage, trying to establish lanes of fire before German armored counterattacks arrived. When the Mortain counteroffensive surged in early August, Panzer Grenadiers rode behind Panzer IVs and occasional Panthers. Their disciplined coordination drilled at training centers such as Putlos in Schleswig-Holstein. They exploited every gap in American support, probing junctions where infantry and armor cooperation faltered. The Browning M250 caliber, introduced in the 1930s, and weighing over 80 pounds with its cradle, could reach out to roughly 1,800 meters in skilled hands, its 12.799mm rounds capable of chewing into lightly armored half-tracks and turret optics. Yet Allied doctrine emphasized steady suppression to keep heads down rather than precise rhythmic isolation of weak points, and gunners were expected to anchor defensive perimeters with broad streams of fire rather than finely carved bursts. Through July 1944, after-action reports noted that American machine gun crews often struggled when enemy armor advanced in tight columns along hedgerow corridors. Browning teams, firing long continuous bursts, sometimes overheated barrels and peppered heavy frontal plates to little effect. German crews, confident behind interleaved road wheels and sloped armor on the Panther, called Allied fire scattered heat, rarely threatening periscopes, track links, or commander cupolas. Incremental improvements in U.S. armor doctrine could not keep pace with the fluid tempo, prompting frontline improvisation. Within this crucible, a technical sergeant assigned to a mobile anti-armor element began imagining the battlefield as a grid, where timed bursts could snip at observation devices, hatch seams, and vulnerable track assemblies without wasting ammunition. Quietly he practiced pacing, short bursts, timed counts, and deliberate shifts along a predictable pattern in the chaos of woodland roads. As Allied mechanization increased, the pressure to act decisively rewarded initiative that could crack the psychological shell of even well-trained Panzer Grenadiers. This environment nurtured an unauthorized technique that would later confound German intelligence, but to grasp how it emerged, The story now narrows toward the Browning's mechanical traits and the visual rhythm this gunner learned to impose upon them. By the summer of 1944, the Browning M2 heavy machine gun had evolved into the backbone of American mobile firepower. Its combined weight with tripod approaching 38 kilograms and its cyclic rate fluctuating between 450 and 575 rounds per minute, depending on maintenance and environmental conditions. Firing 12.7 9mm cartridges, originally designed in the late 1910s for anti-aircraft and anti-armor roles, the weapon could punch through thin steel plates found on German Südkämpfe, 251 half-tracks, lightly protected turret viewports, and the exposed cupolas of reconnaissance vehicles. Standard doctrine, drilled endlessly at bases such as Fort Benning in 1943, demanded steady, disciplined bursts along a single target, emphasizing barrel life and simple suppression rather than exploitation of weak points. Yet one gunner, restless during range sessions, began mentally counting fractions of seconds between trigger squeezes, letting the barrel's natural recoil and traverse settle into a rhythm. Instead of sweeping his fire in a long, wasteful arc, he created an alternating ladder effect, hopping between hard edges, turret rings, track guides, vision slits, coaxial housings, even vulnerable radio aerials jutting like brittle reeds. The M2's heavy bolt and reciprocating mass provided a predictable momentum, allowing the gunner to time his corrections so that each short burst landed where armor or optics were thinnest. Late 1944 allocations of armor-piercing and incendiary belts added a psychological edge. Sparks bloomed against steel, and small internal fires ignited stowed tarps or spare track blocks, convincing crews they were under a more sophisticated assault than the battlefield actually offered. German field notes from September speculated that the Americans had introduced electrically assisted fire control aids to cluster impacts with uncanny precision, misreading pattern and tempo as mechanical guidance. This experiment, though unauthorized and potentially punishable for deviating from doctrine, survived through skirmish after skirmish, refining range estimation and timing until it matured into a distinct battlefield signature. With confidence rising and ammunition allocation briefly improving, the gunner awaited a target worthy of demonstration, setting the stage for the armored clash that would carry his pattern into whispered reports across staff headquarters. September 1944 arrived with a brittle chill east of Lunéville, where the German 111th Panzer Brigade probed the rural road network, hoping to blunt the U.S. Third Army's widening reach. Hedgerows and shallow rises funneled their vehicles into stretched columns that rattled with clinking track guides and the low murmur of intercom chatter. An American M20 armored utility car waited behind a grassy swell. Its Browning M2 settled into a field of fire that began at roughly 300 meters. When the lead Panzer IV eased around a bend, the gunner's pattern erupted, not as a continuous sweep, but as short-timed bursts that struck the commander's cupola, then the periscope collar, then the turret ring in unnerving rhythm. Sparks flared along steel, the commander jerked backward, and the tank lurched to a halt. Confusion rippled down the road. Behind it, a second vehicle received a tight cluster of impacts along its right track guide, severing already stressed links and forcing it to skew across the lane. Infantry escorts dove along ditch lines as stowed fuel cans on a half-track flickered into flame, their thin skins no match for armor-piercing incendiary belts. Surviving Panzer grenadiers later recalled believing multiple heavy guns were operating in concert, because the impacts landed almost simultaneously across different vehicles. Radios filled with clipped contradictory fragments before static rolled over them, as the psychological weight of losing leaders within seconds sapped initiative. That hesitation proved fatal. German tanks from the 4th Armored Division, hidden in woodland cover, pushed forward, their 75mm guns hammering the column's immobilized core. By the time German officers realized their armor had been pinned by what seemed like mechanical precision, momentum was gone. In the aftermath, field staff scribbled hasty notes, questioning whether the Browning had been fitted with some form of assisted targeting. These early rumors crawled through intelligence desks, feeding an expanding web of speculation that would soon demand deeper explanation, drawing military analysts toward the riddle of this stepping fire. In the days that followed the clash near Lunéville, Surviving crewmen and Panzer grenadiers were pulled aside by intelligence personnel within Army Group G, their uniforms still flecked with soot and dust as they offered disjointed accounts. By 18th September 1944, enough testimony had accumulated to unsettle staff officers in makeshift command posts, where maps curled at the edges from lamp heat and diesel fumes hung in the air. Some tank commanders swore the American heavy machine guns had been modified to fire faster than standard, mistaking the gunners' timed bursts for accelerated cyclic rates rather than disciplined pacing. Others claimed they saw traces appear at perfectly spaced intervals, as though 2 or 3 gunners were coordinating their fire across a hidden defensive line. At a divisional briefing in Nancy on 20th September, analysts delivered cautious conclusions. Allied gunners appeared trained to prioritize turret rings, cupola openings, and viewports, and German crews should keep hatches closed earlier and reinforce sensitive points with spare track links, a field expedient that added weight and cramped visibility. These recommendations leaked quickly into rumor. Infantry platoons idle behind hedgerows began layering sandbags atop hulls, hoping to dampen impact angles, while reconnaissance troops hesitated near wooded bends. Convinced American defenders could leap their fire from target to target without pause, whisper campaigns spread beyond formal memos. A courier reported overhearing junior officers speak of an Allied column breaker technique, while quartermasters wondered whether incendiary belts were being mixed with new armor-piercing loads in secret ratios. The tangible result was hesitation. Counterattacks took longer to form, fuel was wasted dispersing columns prematurely, and radio nets clogged with nervous requests for clarifications that never arrived. German morale, already frayed by supply shortages, sagged under the notion that American machine gun doctrine had shifted overnight. Logisticians on the Allied side felt the pressure too, accelerating ammunition deliveries to sustain the heavy tempo of fire demanded by advancing combined arms formations. The invisible engine of the war, the factories, loading docks, and ship convoys that fed metal into barrels, quietly enabled frontline experimentation to flourish. To appreciate how such firepower could be sustained across an entire theater, her attention must now turn toward the industrial machinery behind America's battlefield ubiquity. By the autumn of 1944, the United States could draw upon an industrial engine unmatched in the European theater, pouring steel and powder into the war at a pace that seemed surreal to weary frontline soldiers. More than 2 million .50-caliber machine gun barrels had been manufactured by this point, and hundreds of millions of linked 12.7 to 99mm cartridges streamed from factories across Illinois, Connecticut, and Ohio, where shift whistles echoed through the night and conveyor belts rattled like distant thunder. Armor-piercing incendiary loads emerged in bulk from specialized lines, their tips painted and checked by inspectors, bent over endless rows of crates. This industrial reach translated into logistical muscle. Quartermasters assigned to Patton's Third Army diverted trains along recently liberated rail corridors, pushing ammunition through Commercy and even the scarred yards near Verdun, sometimes using sidings repaired only hours before. Drivers bounced over patched roads in olive-drab trucks stacked with wooden crates, while depot crews fine-tuned routing schedules to keep belts flowing to the front. Because ammunition arrived with such consistency, American gunners could afford to experiment. The unauthorized ladder pattern, once practiced quietly behind hedgerows, now had an inexhaustible well of cartridges to sharpen its timing. Each engagement became a rehearsal, each burst an iterative improvement. German analysts acknowledged the Allies' industrial advantage, but underestimated its true weight. They assumed sheer numbers alone explained American pressure, not the way abundance emboldened tactical creativity at the squad level. Meanwhile, scarcity plagued German units. Fuel shortages forced panzer columns to compress into tighter formations, saving petrol but stacking targets. Ammunition rationing required commanders to hold fire until decisive range, reducing suppressive flexibility. These constraints, born of overextended supply lines and bombing campaigns against synthetic fuel plants, tightened the vise on German morale. Field reports sent back to U.S. depots in October praised improved chrome-lined barrels, noting less wear even under high-volume use, extending service life and keeping guns in action through colder, wetter weather. All these elements, The factories, sidings, convoys, and metallurgical tweaks nourished the conditions that allowed the patterned fire to spread from curiosity to battlefield signature. As rains thickened the roads and forests darkened, a harsher engagement awaited, ready to test whether this technique could survive terrain and weather as easily as it had shattered armor near Lunéville. November 1944 settled cold and heavy over the Schnee Eifel, where fog pooled in the valleys like pale smoke and muffled every engine note until steel hulls loomed at uncomfortably close range. Allied reconnaissance patrols along the forested ridgelines heard the probing advance of elements from the German 2nd Panzer Division before they saw them, the clatter of track guides echoing against moss-draped trunks. Visibility fell to mere dozens of meters at times, slowing the German column into a compressed trail that twisted through pines slick with frost. The American gunner, now seasoned by weeks of experimentation, positioned his M2 near a small clearing roughly 250 meters from the forest path, its tripod legs anchored in damp leaves. When the first armored car nosed into view, his pattern restarted like a well-rehearsed cadence. A short burst snapped at the cupola rim, a second nipped the exposed jerrycans lashed to the flank, and a third clipped the track guide with disruptive force. Sparks flickered into the fog, and within seconds smoke streamed upward through the canopy. Our second armored car arrived into chaos, receiving its own set of precisely spaced impacts that struck so quickly the crew believed at least 2 heavy guns had them bracketed. German infantry dismounted in panic, sliding behind tree trunks too slender to stop .50 caliber rounds, their helmets ringing from ricochets that danced along hull plating like orange-white fireflies. After-action notes recorded by battalion intelligence described the fire as eerily coordinated, again suspecting synchronized gunners hidden along the tree line. Fog-dampened acoustics warped return fire, turning the forest into a maze of phantom echoes. German planners debated widening column spacing to mitigate cascading immobilization, but fuel scarcity chained vehicles together. Each meter of dispersion meant more petrol burned, and the synthetic fuel plants hammered by Allied bombers left little margin for tactical liberty. Allied commanders observing the engagement noted how disabling only the lead and second vehicles froze the entire trail, trapping crews in a funnel of splintering bark and ricocheting metal. The Schnee Eifel proved that the pattern was not merely a trick of open farmland. It thrived in sloped forested terrain, where ricochets sowed confusion and the tempo of impacts shattered confidence. German soldiers described a creeping dread that viewports and hatch seams could be plucked from a map by an unseen hand, while American units quietly spread word of the gunner's technique as winter storms thickened and the front creaked under mounting pressure. With success now repeating across varied landscapes, the pattern's psychological weight grew heavier than its raw mechanical damage, setting the stage for the broader mental toll it would exert as both armies braced for winter's brutal campaigns. December 1944 draped the Ardennes and the Schnee Eifel in a muted hush, the forests heavy with snowmelt and the sky low with pewter clouds that swallowed sound. Along forward positions, German infantry passed nervous rumors by lantern glow, whispering about an American heavy machine gun whose bursts seemed to step deliberately across armor and earth. Troops claimed they could feel the rhythm before they heard it, a stuttering tempo that blurred direction and left them convinced multiple firing points tracked their every move. Tank commanders, once accustomed to scanning from open hatches, now clamped down steel lids even while advancing, trading precious visibility for perceived safety. Visibility decreased, situational comprehension eroded, and armored columns lingered seconds too long at road junctions or open clearings. On those seconds, winter battle fortunes turned. Allied patrols observed vehicles pausing at the mouths of valleys or hesitating at tree-line edges, unwilling to crest rises where hatch seams and cupola slits might be plucked by invisible pulses of fire. American soldiers watching from foxholes felt their confidence rise. When a single burst sequence halted a half-track or forced infantry to flatten themselves behind brittle snowbanks, it confirmed their belief that they possessed a hidden edge. German propaganda leaflets fluttered into American trenches, attempting to dismiss Allied heavy machine gun capability while inadvertently validating the fear by acknowledging it. Panzer grenadiers processed through medical intake stations muttered that the gun selected them, amplifying the dread of exposure during short rushes between tree trunks. For German units struggling with fuel starvation and thinning personnel, hesitation became the enemy within, eroding momentum during the crucial first seconds of contact. Allied combined arms doctrine thrived in this environment, emboldened by earlier mobilizations that allowed Sherman crews and infantry squads to pounce. As January's snow glazed the roads and froze track grease into stubborn paste, the psychological tremor spread deeper than the muzzle's mechanical bite. Officers adjusted march intervals and column composition, burning precious fuel to gain meters of spacing. Reconnaissance troopers reported forests that felt watched, a consequence of rhythm rather than massed fire. Winter campaigns hinge not only on armor thickness or shell weight, but on the fragile nerve encouraging a crew to push forward into the unknown. The stepping bursts struck that nerve at the moment of decision, freezing intent long enough for Allied formations to seize initiative. Those ripples, barely visible at first contact, would broaden into operational consequences as the war lurched toward its final grinding months, where doubt weighed as heavily as steel on every battlefield lane. Early December 1944 found German armored doctrine straining beneath the weight of narrowed opportunities. The West Wall's approaches funneled spearheads through ravines, stone-lined villages, and forest lanes polished slick by winter frost, where seconds of hesitation invited catastrophe. Armored thrusts depended upon surprise and velocity, yet Allied reconnaissance patrols, guided by sharp radio discipline, hovered near choke points and reported movements with unnerving speed. Heavy machine gun teams learned to anchor these bottlenecks, treating lead vehicles as pressure points. When the unauthorized stepping pattern struck a column's foremost tank or armored car, mobility collapsed behind it, like a folding accordion. Within the 2nd Panzer Division, after-action recommendations urged infantry to tighten their proximity to tanks, contradicting pre-war manuals that prized flexible spacing. Armored car crews, desperate to protect command vehicles, positioned their hulls as impromptu shields. These adjustments compressed formations further, offering the pattern broader reach, short bursts that clipped radio aerials, scarred command cupolas, and jammed external hinges, severed the quiet thread of coordination on which breakthroughs relied. Allied officers noted how a single, immobilized lead vehicle stalled a column long enough for artillery to pivot fire missions. In the frosted woods of the Ardennes, that minute of delay might mean howitzer shells beginning to chatter overhead, or Sherman platoons reversing out of reserve positions onto flanking trails. Strategically, momentum bled away. Surprise withered when roads clogged with steel. German brigades petitioned for additional skirt armor around viewports and hatch rings, but industrial shortages, made acute by bombed plants and dwindling alloy stocks, left those requests unrealized. American planners, recognizing how easily burst-timed fire unraveled spearheads, integrated machine gun ambush points into defensive matrices along approach corridors, ensuring that every likely lane of advance risked interruption. At the battalion level, draft doctrinal notes quietly recommended bursts directed at command hatches and radio masts rather than broad suppressive arcs. The pattern's influence became visible not only in stories whispered over winter fires, but in margin notes along official memoranda. Yet battlefield evolution seldom travels in a single direction. As winter deepened and ice thickened on receiver groups, limitations emerged. The gun's cadence faltered when barrels cooled unevenly or traverse froze in place. Dense snowfall blurred sightlines and dampened spark trails that once sowed disorientation. These shortcomings hinted that even innovation must bend under harsher constraints, ushering the story toward the weaknesses that would soon demand further adaptation. January 1945 settled into the Ardennes with a bitterness that crept into steel and bone alike, dragging temperatures low enough to sap the warmth from lubricants and stiffen weapon mechanisms. The Browning M2, normally smooth in its cycling rhythm, began to falter. Frozen oil thickened within the receiver, stretching the interval between trigger releases just enough to disturb the gunner's carefully timed ladder of bursts. Delayed resets blurred the pattern, causing impacts to drift across armor in unintended arcs. Crews responded by thinning their lubricant mixtures and working the charging handles repeatedly, to break mechanical drag. Yet every adjustment risked seizing receivers or exhausting limited cold weather oils. On the German side, adaptation quickened. Spare track links were welded around cupolas and makeshift plates bolted near periscopes, adding weight and straining turret motors but shrinking exposed steel. Commanders closed their hatches earlier, making viewport strikes rare but sacrificing situational awareness in the woods. Those changes forced the pattern to chase secondary targets, radio masts, external stowage, track guides, which did not always yield the same immediate paralysis. Ammunition constraints also emerged as Allied supply corridors stretched across snowbound lanes. Practice belts were rationed, and newer crews lacked the fluency to reproduce the precise timing that gave the pattern its unnerving edge. Some American officers argued that focusing on rhythmic stepping diluted suppression of high-priority threats, advocating sustained fire on a single vehicle over intricate hopping. Proponents countered by shortening burst lengths to reduce barrel wear and slowing traverse rates to accommodate greater spacing between German tanks. The arrival of late-war Panzer modifications, improved turret ring guards and reinforced hatch collars, further dampened effectiveness, demanding new angles of approach. Even the earth conspired. Frozen ground flattened ricochet patterns, sending rounds into harmless spirals instead of showering sparks along hulls, robbing the pattern of part of its psychological sting. Still, the original gunner refined his internal cadence, counting fractions more slowly to account for cold, thick drag, and listening for the subtle clack that confirmed proper bolt return. He learned to pivot early toward command vehicles whenever improvised plating appeared on cupolas, prioritizing radios over optics when armor stiffened. Though diminished, the pattern endured, preserved by incremental adaptation rather than sheer repetition. These limitations exposed the boundaries of battlefield improvisation, but also hinted at broader lessons. If timing, target prioritization, and component vulnerability could be married so effectively in the field, then future weapons might be engineered around the same principles rather than discovered by chance. In the thinning winter light, as both armies ground toward exhaustion, the conversation began to drift beyond immediate survival, toward how precision fire might shape doctrines long after the Ardennes thawed. May 1945 ended the gunfire, but not the questions. As Germany capitulated, Allied intelligence branches sifted through captured documents, after-action reports and field memoranda, searching for patterns of innovation that had emerged beneath the smoke. Among the findings was a short thread, a heavy machine gun firing rhythm that had unsettled armored crews and fractured column momentum. Officially unauthorized and never formalized in wartime manuals, it nonetheless highlighted a principle that would echo into the decades ahead: disable awareness, not just armor. Analysts noted how the laddered bursts plucked at command cupolas, viewports, radio masts, and observation slits, reducing a tank's eyes rather than cracking its shell. As Cold War tensions simmered, new doctrinal drafts began to emphasize component-targeted sequencing, imagining future engagements where precision mattered more than penetration. Mechanical timing, once tallied in a gunner's pulse, evolved into optical rangefinders, stabilized fire control systems, and later digital ballistic computers that could hop rapidly between subsystems. Design bureaus took note. Post-war armored vehicles thickened the protection around periscopes and vision blocks, burying them behind composite folders or protected housings. Rotorcraft gunships, when they emerged in Vietnam-era concepts, carried weapon pods designed to sweep across mobility components, tires, masts, antennas with split bursts reminiscent of that improvised cadence along French hedgerows. Artillery target selection algorithms, refined through the 1950s, distributed fire across command vans, radar trucks, and radio relays rather than pounding a single hull. Training manuals quietly appended notes about periscope vulnerability, a recognition that vision, not armor, anchored a crew's will to fight. Veterans who had witnessed the pattern remembered how a single gun, timed correctly, seemed to reach into the minds of armored crews more effectively than thicker plate. The unnamed gunner never saw his name in headlines, and his innovation remained a marginal footnote in formal debriefings. Yet his field-born intuition seeped into institutional thought, proving that tactical improvisation can reshape the scaffolding of doctrine. As historians trace that thread backward, The story returns to a misted road near Lunéville, where fear, steel, and improvisation collided in the first stepping bursts, an echo that still whispers through the evolution of fire control. September 1944 remains suspended in memory like a breath held too long. The mist outside Lunéville curling around halted armor whose engines ticked in cooling protest. Commanders lay silent behind fractured optics, their once confident visibility reduced to shadowed slits and smeared glass. Infantry who had advanced at a brisk trot now stumbled backward in confusion, haunted by the sensation that unseen barrels tracked them with impossible precision. A single unauthorized firing pattern had fractured the momentum of a mechanized assault, not through weight of metal or depth of armor, but through timing, insight, and the courage to deviate from rote doctrine. German survivors swore they had faced multiple weapons, convinced that technology lurked behind those stepping bursts, as though gears and circuits, decades before their time, had guided American fire. That perception alone reshaped their behavior, proving that fear can be manufactured as surely as ammunition. The Browning M2 remained unchanged in weight and dimensions, its steel no different than the millions shipped across the ocean. Yet its potential expanded in the hands of a mind willing to reconsider where bullets should fall. Snow-choked trails in the Schneeeifel and frost-bitten clearings in the Ardennes repeated the lesson. Innovation blooms not in laboratories alone, but in the silent calculations of those who must survive the next minute. Post-war tacticians quietly absorbed the message. Disable vision, sever awareness, and even thick armor becomes blind steel. Plates may grow thicker, alloys more complex, but vision stays vulnerable, and morale more fragile than metal. In remembering how one gunner's rhythmic bursts halted a column, we acknowledge an enduring truth. Battlefields bend not only to the strongest weapon, but to those rare individuals who glimpse patterns in chaos, shaping destiny with each measured pull of the trigger.